Christ is risen. This is where you get to say, He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Do it one more time. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Yes, happy Easter morning, Substack community. Being someone who's kind of that traditional upper Midwesterner and a little bit advised not to show a ton of emotion, Easter and its excitement and joy and celebration is not always the most natural for me, but I am genuinely so excited and joyful to be with you all here on Sunday morning on Easter and to celebrate. And so this year, I thought I would have this really awesome opportunity. I'm serving on staff at Lake Nokomis Lutheran Church here in Minneapolis, and I'll be there with my family this morning on Easter, admittedly wearing a very different Easter appropriate outfit. But because of this Substack community and the tradition we have of gathering together on Sunday mornings to be in the Bible, to be in the Word, to be with one another, I thought I also get this opportunity to preach kind of a little mini sermon for you all and to celebrate in this joy of Easter after we've really journeyed through Lent together, even in the midst of my book tour with these Lenten Wednesday videos, and also on Maundy Thursday, Jesus' betrayal, his arrest, the Last Supper, into Good Friday and Jesus' death, that we need to be together too on Easter morning for the resurrection. So let me share our Easter gospel. I'll share a little bit of a sermon, and then I really pray that all of you get the opportunity to be with a local church community, to be with your loved ones, and to really embrace the celebration of this day. Life is hard. The world is hard. There's war. There's hatred. There are so many who are trying to take this joyful, inclusive story of Jesus and make it narrow and angry and mean. And so we can't give in. We have to fight it with truth and justice, but also with joy. And today's a day for joy. So let's read together today. Our Easter gospel this year is from the Gospel of Luke. I'm going to read chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find Jesus' body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to the apostles an idle tale, and they did not believe the women. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. This is the gospel of our Lord for this Easter Sunday. Thanks be to God. So I want to just start by taking a few moments to talk about, we spend time in the Sunday stretch talking about how the Bible has to be understood not as just one singular word of God that somehow just arrived on earth, but instead it's a lot of different words of God that's come through fallible human minds, human translations, human words. And as is the case, as we've talked about in Genesis and these different stories of creation, in the Gospels, it's the same thing. We have 4 unique Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of them tells the story of Jesus through their own slightly different perspective. So rather than thinking that somehow these 4 different gospel stories, if they're not exactly the same, that somehow that diminishes God's truth, instead we get to acknowledge that hearing the same story through slightly different voices and nuances helps us to get a greater glimpse into that diversity, the inclusivity, and really the joy of God's unique and rich story. So let's talk about Luke. Luke of the Gospels, I'm going to go out on a limb and say Luke is the most Gentile of the Gospels. Matthew's Gospel is very rooted in Jewish thought. It's very rooted in the Hebrew Bible. Mark is this gospel of action. It's the shortest gospel and it moves quickly from place to place. John is this gospel that comes from its own unique, set-apart community. And as such, it emphasizes how the Christian community in following Jesus is supposed to be set apart. So what about Luke, our gospel for this year? I said it's the most Gentile of the Gospels. It comes rooted not only in the Hebrew Bible or Jewish tradition, but also comes rooted in Greek thought and tradition and language. Luke is known as the beloved physician, and you may also know that Luke is the first volume in a 2-volume set. So the person in the community that gave birth to the Gospel of Luke also continues, and this makes sense if you think about it as the most Gentile gospel. It continues into the book of Acts and the expansion of Jesus' gospel and Jesus' Christian community into much of the Greco-Roman world, into what is today Greece and Turkey and even parts of Italy and Europe and Asia and Africa. So it's a gospel that is filled with miracle stories. And again, written by someone who is known as the beloved physician. Now, I'm going to make a connection here, so stay with me. Luke, the beloved physician, makes me think of a TV show that I've been watching recently. My husband Ben and I are coming up to the end of this HBO show called The Pit. And this show traces just so far one single day in the life of a hospital in downtown Pittsburgh, and specifically in the emergency room department. Now, what's fascinating to me about The Pit, about this show, is that I've been told by a couple of different, at least medical professionals, one of whom is an ER doctor here in the Twin Cities, and another of whom is a nurse who's worked in ICU and now works in the ER department in a hospital outside of Sacramento, California. And both of these people have told me that this show is the most realistic depiction of their lives as ER doctors that they have ever encountered on TV before. So that's pretty remarkable, because if you've been watching The Pit, and as I've seen it, on one hand, I was hoping it wasn't realistic because it looks so difficult. You know, every single second, these medical professionals are confronted with, obviously, emergencies. They have people who are living on the streets who have to come to the ER just for baseline medical care. And so they see them and get to know them day after day. And the frustrating part of that for these medical professionals is knowing that even as they're seeking to treat and care for people who are living on the streets, they know that they're just a tiny little piece of a much bigger problem that's facing poor people in this country, that's facing people who are dealing with addiction or mental illness in this country. And they're just kind of like that little Dutch boy sticking their finger in the dike of trying to provide care and help, but knowing that there's such a bigger problem that needs to be addressed. So you have that level, you have just immense tragedy, and then you have the business side. You know, there's this business administrator who's always coming down into the ER department and trying to talk about things like metrics or charting or technology. And meanwhile, these staff members are trying desperately to save lives, chronically understaffed, chronically overworked, dealing with spiritual care dilemmas, mental health dilemmas, burnout, exhaustion. It's just been a really powerful show. And I bring it up in the midst of this Easter sermon because I also see, as we're watching that show, you know, the powerful side and the miraculous side of medical care, of those people who are working, and they each have a specific role to play, they're all, I'm blown away by how incredibly smart they are, how much knowledge they have, and how they really deeply know that they need each other and have to trust one another. And so I can see this dilemma for so many people, and I know this extends to other professions as well. I'm thinking of my fellow faith leaders. I'm thinking of teachers. I'm thinking of so many of us who are trying to work in fields to do good, and we're beset by all these outer obstacles and profit margins. But we also stay in it because we know the miracles that can occur when people are working together. And so you see that in the pit. And it made me think of the Gospel of Luke, of the ways that the beloved physician tells us about the miracles that Jesus is doing, and how throughout this gospel we see that those miracles are not just about a singular God, but about the ways that those miracles come through the Christian community. And so often in the Gospel of Luke, they come through women. This is the gospel of the women at the tomb. We read verse 10. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James. Note that James is Jesus' brother, so Mary also the mother of Jesus. And here the other women who told this to the apostles. Now to me, it's very clear that as history has been handed down, as these stories have been handed down, we have learned half of the story. We've learned of the male apostles and disciples, but it is very clear to me that there were also female disciples, those who walked right alongside with Jesus, those who were sharing the message of the gospel. And in fact, it's these women who share the story of the resurrection. They go back and tell the apostles what has occurred. And now read verse 11. That these words seemed to them, to the apostles, an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Oof. Do you know what it's like to not be believed? To not be heard? To not be listened to? To feel so deeply called by God, by your circumstances, to share the truth, and to not be heard, to not be believed. I can tell you, I have felt like that. It is an awful feeling. And I think what we have for us in those moments, in this text on Easter Sunday, that God too knows what that's like. And in fact, maybe it's a necessary part of the theology of the cross, of following Jesus, to not be believed, because Jesus also was not believed and not listened to. And so maybe it's for that reason that Jesus entrusts his most important miracle, the most important action of God, the resurrection, to those who were likely not to be believed and not be heard. And the miracle is that we still have this story 2025 years later. We have this story originally told by those who the world was told not to believe. Mary Magdalene, maligned throughout history as somehow some kind of sex worker, some kind of woman of shame, and instead one of the greatest gospel truth tellers, preachers, followers, friend, associate of Jesus. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, healed by Jesus, married, we're told, to a servant who was the head of Herod's household, Chusa, a woman from deep within the hierarchy who had to watch as her husband and her family served this man who was treating God's people so poorly at the hands of empire. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, Jesus' mother, who also was written off as young, unmarried, who's been held up sometimes by the Western church as good because somehow of her purity, her virginity. But instead, Jesus tells us that she too was one of the first to whom he gave and entrusted this message of resurrection. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women. Who might they be? What are their stories? What are their names? We honor them and give gratitude to them today, because it was because of their witness, a witness that was not initially believed, that we have today the story of the resurrection. So this message of hope and celebration for us today is that in a world that does not want to hear the truth too often, in a world that ignores the most important messengers of love and truth, in a world where when you speak truth, you will likely be ignored and unheard and dismissed, God hears. Jesus hears. And in the end, cynicism and dismissal and ignorance does not win, because today, on this Easter morning, Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. One more time, you can say it with me. Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. Thanks for being a part of this Substack community. Happy Easter. We'll be back again next week with the Sunday Stretch. Have a wonderful day.